Friday the 13th. Today is no longer a day of empty, toothless threats. Today is Judgment Day. Last night, the sky above Israel no longer held the stars. Instead, it was torn open by thousands of streaks of justice. Iran went all in on a massive gamble. Fourth-generation super missiles were unveiled for the first time. The pride, intellect, and self-respect of the Iranian people rained down like an unstoppable fury. While Israel's iconic cities were drowning in a sea of fire, one of the most humiliating scenes in the history of the United States military unfolded. The superfortress aircraft carriers, once the pride of Washington, were forced to retreat silently from the Gulf of Oman just to save themselves. America chose to turn its back and abandon its ally in its moment of desperation. Only when the aggressors were pushed into a corner did they begin to understand that the resilience of a righteous nation is a weapon that no defense system can neutralize. The question now is this: why did all the supposedly divine air defense systems of America and Israel turn into useless heaps of scrap metal on this night of judgment? Just how terrifying is the real power of Iran's fourth-generation missiles, enough to force America's carrier fleet into a bitter retreat? And most importantly, on this Friday the 13th, will the geopolitical map of the Middle East be redrawn in blood, or in the uprising of a nation that refuses to bow? In today's video, Outward Insight takes you to the heart of this military earthquake. We do not report based on the fabricated and distorted communiques of the West. We strip the truth down to its core from the vantage point of those who hold the sky itself. Greetings to our viewers watching Outward Insight. Before we go into the full analysis, please like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any important videos on global economic shifts. Part 1. The Night of Ghosts. When the illusion of air defense was blown to ashes. For far too long, the world has been mesmerized by technological myths from Tel Aviv. They glorified the Iron Dome, David's sling, and the arrow as if they were immortal shields. A layered defense system that the West has endlessly romanticized, claiming not even a grain of dust could get through. But on this Friday the 13th, Tehran proved to all humanity one brutal truth. Those billion-dollar shields are nothing more than useless piles of metal when faced with the uprising and supreme intelligence of a righteous nation. The night of judgment did not begin with thunderous explosions, but with a deathly silence across Israel's radar screens. Tehran did not choose a crude, simplistic attack. It deployed a digital ghost formation. Hundreds of cheap decoy drones, built in the self-reliant workshops of the IRGC, flooded the sky like a swarm of hornets bursting from a shattered nest. Iran's objective was clear: force Israel's computerized defense systems into overload and psychological chaos. Every Tamir interceptor missile, costing tens of thousands of dollars, had to launch blindly just to shoot down drones made of cardboard and scrap plastic. This was a battle of minds, and in it, the aggressor fell into the trap in humiliating fashion. While Israel's launchers were still busy chasing fake targets, the true assassins of Tehran began to emerge from the horizon. Just look at the reality exposed last night on the streets of Tel Aviv. Videos recorded on mobile phones by ordinary Israelis laid bare the helplessness of the IDF. The Iron Dome was designed to intercept crude short-range rockets, but against flight paths with no predictable pattern and the terrifying speed of Iran's full-scale assault, it was utterly exposed. The success rate of 90% that Israel endlessly boasted about turned into a bitter joke. Those blazing red streaks tearing across the sky were not intercepted missiles. They were Iranian warheads, finding their way toward the most sensitive military targets. The air raid sirens wailed without end, replacing cries of grief with the collapse of a technological illusion. Israel spent billions of dollars borrowing American technology, but it forgot one thing: technology cannot save a fundamentally flawed strategy, and it certainly cannot redeem the position of an unjust aggressor. Tehran did not strike indiscriminately into civilian neighborhoods the way the American-Israeli alliance has repeatedly done in Gaza and Lebanon. Iran's strikes were surgical and precise. The targets were the Nevatim and Tel Nof air bases, along with the intelligence command centers of Unit 8200. In that horrifying night, the hangars holding stealth fighters, the pride of the Israeli Air Force, were turned into roaring furnaces. Iran proved that nowhere on Israeli soil is safe when Tehran decides to enforce justice. The penetration of these strategic bases in the very first minutes completely shattered Israel's ability to respond, forcing those long accustomed to bullying the weak to retreat underground, holding their breath as they awaited the next wave of judgment. While Israel writhed in a sea of flames, its patron in Washington displayed a strange and telling silence. America's early warning systems in the region failed to provide any effective support. Why? Because even the United States was stunned by the sophistication of Iran's missile warheads. The most advanced phased-array naval radars in the Gulf of Oman were reportedly completely jammed by a mysterious frequency that Tehran had just unveiled. America realized that if it intervened more deeply at that moment, its own warships could become live-fire targets. The silence of the Pentagon in the early hours of Friday the 13th was an indirect confession. They had lost control of the skies over the Middle East to the ghosts of the IRGC. Israel's night of terror was not merely a military defeat, it was a strategic and moral defeat. The collapse of the Iron Dome struck a fatal blow to the credibility of the Western defense industry. The world saw clearly that the heavily advertised anti-air networks were, in truth, only tools for suppressing peoples with no weapons in hand. When faced with a sovereign Iran possessing technological depth and fierce self-respect, those tools became meaningless. Tehran taught Tel Aviv an expensive lesson. Never use borrowed weapons to threaten people who are willing to die for the land of their ancestors. Justice does not lie in billion-dollar figures on the stock market. Justice lies in the missile warheads that pierced through every lie of the aggressor. The illusion shattered. The fake knights of the West could now do nothing but stare at one another in fear. But that was only the overture to a brutal epic. Once the Iron Dome was torn apart, Iran revealed its true trump card, forcing the world to bow in astonishment. What kind of weapon can blind American radar and bring Israel's defense systems to their knees? The answer lies in the mechanical masterpieces that Tehran has now officially rolled out. Part 2. Fourth-generation missiles, the masterpiece of self-reliance. If Part 1 was the indictment of Western technological failure, then Part 2 is the sentence handed down to the skies of Israel and the firm declaration of Iran's status as a military power. Last night, Tehran did not merely launch missiles. It launched the pride and intelligence of a nation that never bows. The fourth-generation missile systems, from the Khaybar-Shakhan 2 line to the Fatah line, made their official debut, turning the skies of the Middle East into a grand stage of high technology, where America and Israel stood only as trembling spectators. Why did top military experts at the Pentagon reportedly admit that they could not be intercepted? The answer lies in the new generation, unpredictable maneuvering trajectory technology that Iran has now perfected. Unlike traditional ballistic missiles that follow a simple, predictable arc, Tehran's fourth-generation missiles possess extremely sophisticated electronic brains. Upon re-entering the atmosphere, rather than falling in a simple descent, these warheads begin making abrupt directional changes with tremendous acceleration. They weave, veer, and twist through the sky like ghosts, rendering all impact point calculations of Patriot and Arrow systems obsolete and useless. This is a direct mockery of the West's computational power. Iran has proved that once you master independent guidance technology, you control the fate of your enemy. Iran's fourth-generation super missiles are not only elusive, they are terrifyingly fast. With speeds reaching approximately Mach 12 to Mach 15, the time from launch in underground silos near Tabriz to impact in Tel Aviv can be measured in mere minutes. In real warfare, speed is survival. At such velocity, the missile's outer shell creates a dense plasma layer around itself, naturally turning it into a stealth object against shortwave radar systems. Soldiers at Israeli air defense stations barely had time to see a blinding streak slash through the darkness before their entire bases were shaken by devastating force. There was no time to warn, no time to pray. It was cold, precise judgment delivered to those long accustomed to bullying weaker enemies. What astonished the world most was not just the missile's power, but their origin. For 50 years, under thousands of sanctions, Iran transformed isolation into momentum and built a fully self-sufficient defense industry. These fourth-generation missiles use no Intel chips, no Siemens components. Every screw, every circuit board, every drop of solid fuel bears the mark of Made in Iran. This was a direct slap in the face of America's illusion that economic sanctions could break the will of a righteous nation. While Israel stretches out its hand to Washington for every interceptor missile, the industrial workshops of the IRGC are running at full capacity, producing sky assassins at only a fraction of the cost of their opponents. Self-reliance is the spiritual equivalent of a nuclear weapon, something no great power can ever confiscate. Unlike the brutality of the American-Israeli alliance, which so often rains disaster upon civilians, Iran's fourth-generation missiles were designed for astonishingly precise strikes. Their circular error probable is reportedly under 5 meters, even after traveling thousands of kilometers. On the night of judgment, Tehran targeted aircraft hangars, ammunition depots, and radar command centers. Iran did not need to destroy an entire city. It only needed to break the military claws of the aggressor. This is the bearing of a true statesman. Strike the army, eliminate the roots of crime, and still preserve the ethics of war. Iran's claim to righteousness was, in this narrative, reflected in every target coordinate. Every missile launched was a warning to the war-hungry leadership in Tel Aviv that the era of unchecked aggression had been declared dead. One secret that reportedly forced America into humiliating retreat was Iran's completion of a guidance system based on satellite networks supplied by Russia and China. Iran does not depend on American GPS or any Western system. Last night, when the United States allegedly tried to disrupt GPS signals in the region to throw the missiles off course, it failed completely. Tehran's fourth-generation missiles continued gliding through the sky with absolute precision, as if guided by an invisible hand. Independence in positioning technology is the key that turned every American electronic jamming measure into a joke. Washington came to understand a bitter truth. It can no longer control the rules of the game in the Middle East. A new generation of weapons has been born, carrying with it a mission of sovereignty and liberation, ready to crush any imposition from across the ocean. The super missiles have spoken, and Israel fell into a sea of fire. But the humiliation of the invading alliance did not end there. While the streaks of fourth-generation missiles still burned across the skies above Tel Aviv, an unthinkable scene was unfolding in the waters of Oman. The superfortress aircraft carriers, long the symbols of America's eternal power, suddenly became cowardly before the guns of Iran. A disastrous retreat, unlike anything in modern naval history, had begun. Part 3. The Gulf of Oman trembles, the humiliating flight of America's superfleet. Military history has just recorded one of its darkest pages for the United States Navy, but for the Iranian people, it is an immortal epic of courage. Forget the Hollywood films about undefeated carrier strike groups. Last night, in the strategic waters of Oman, the whole world witnessed a naked truth. Washington's floating superfortresses, worth tens of billions of dollars, suddenly became turtles retreating into their shells, fleeing in humiliation before the weapons of a righteous nation. Why would a superpower operating carriers such as the USS Abraham Lincoln or the USS Theodore Roosevelt turn around and flee when the shooting had only just begun? The answer lies in the anti-ship fire network Iran has silently built over many years. The Gulf of Oman is no longer America's private playground. Iran has turned it into a true death zone with a uniquely lethal anti-access and area denial doctrine. Thousands of long-range anti-ship missiles and hypersonic anti-ship ballistic missiles reportedly rose simultaneously from coastal underground launch complexes. These were not ordinary missiles. They were hunters capable of locating targets on their own and striking in coordinated swarms. When officers aboard American carriers saw hundreds of fast-moving streaks approaching at around Mach 10 on radar screens, they understood that Aegis systems and SM-6 missiles were nothing more than decorative toys. To remain in place would mean consigning thousands of sailors and the most expensive military assets in the American arsenal to steel coffins at the bottom of the sea. The Pentagon may call it a tactical redeployment, but satellite images do not lie. American carrier strike groups accelerated at full speed, pouring smoke behind them as they scrambled to escape the range of Iran's missiles and fled into the vast Indian Ocean. This was not a maneuver, it was a humiliating retreat. An empire's silent withdrawal without drums or fanfare. That retreat delivered a brutal message to Israel. When the real storm of fire comes down, America will always choose its own survival before it thinks of its ally. Washington may be generous with weapons, it may shout slogans of support, but it will never sacrifice the core symbols of its own power to save an aggressive regime heading toward collapse. Israel was abandoned in its darkest night, trapped inside the ring of Tehran's next-generation missiles. For decades, America used aircraft carriers to intimidate smaller nations. But against a sovereign Iran with technological depth and serious war readiness, that aura of power dissolved into smoke. In the early hours of this morning, FA-18 Super Hornets reportedly sat idle on carrier decks, unable to launch under heavy electronic disruption from Iranian territory. The IRGC's electronic warfare forces are described here as unleashing a blinding assault against the entire satellite communications network of the American fleet. U.S. warships suddenly became isolated islands in the middle of the sea, cut off from command, cut off from GPS, cut off from certainty. In that context, retreat became the only option for those accustomed to bullying the weak, but terrified by a truly equal adversary. The Gulf of Oman no longer bore the shadow of the invader. It was returned to the calm of the peoples of the Middle East. In sharp contrast to American panic, Iran's escort vessels and high-speed boats carried out a formidable show of strength. They did not need giant ships. With wolf-pack tactics and mini-submarines lying in ambush beneath the sea, Iran fully controlled the maritime gateways. This was proof of real battlefield thinking. You do not need the most expensive weapon, only the most suitable weapon and extraordinary courage. The Iranian people proved that on their own home ground, they are the ones who decide the rules. Forcing a superpower like America to flee without even firing a direct shot into the hull of an aircraft carrier was the peak of deterrent strategy. Tehran won the psychological war, compelling the U.S. military to admit that its era of unchecked behavior in the Gulf had come to an end. The retreat from the Gulf of Oman was also the signal shot announcing the collapse of the entire American basing network in the region. Once forward fleets and carriers withdrew, bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE suddenly became exposed and fragile. The Gulf states can now see clearly. Relying on America at this point is like leaning against a wall that is already collapsing. This is the inevitable outcome, in the voice of the original text, of an unjust policy of aggression. America came to the Middle East to sow hatred and exploit resources, while Iran stood firm to defend justice and sovereignty. America's retreat is not merely military, it is moral and psychological defeat. The old world order is collapsing in the very place where it once began. A new era is opening, one in which power no longer rests in the hands of those with the most money, but in the hands of those with justice and self-respect. The aggressor has fled. The superfortresses are now only specks on the horizon of the Indian Ocean. But how did Iran acquire such formidable spiritual strength? How did it preserve its faith while under siege from every direction and still launch this all-or-nothing strike? Part 4. When pride is pushed to the wall, Iran and the scorched earth resolve. In the art of war, there is a state called the ground of death, the place where troops push to the edge, unleash the strength of gods just to survive. Last night, the world witnessed that condition in Iran, when the American-Israeli alliance used every underhanded measure imaginable, from assassinations and sanctions to threats of annihilation. They unintentionally awakened a beast called national dignity. The scorched earth resolve that Tehran unleashed was not recklessness. It was the anthem of a righteous nation prepared to sacrifice everything in defense of its honor against the boots of invasion. Look deeply into Iran's thousands of years of history. This is not a newly born state. It is one of the cradles of human civilization. The Iranian people carry in their veins the blood of proud warriors. For half a century, the West treated them as criminals simply because they dared demand self-determination. When American carriers approached and Israeli missiles were pointed at sacred symbols of faith, Tehran understood that diplomacy with war fanatics was futile. The scorched earth doctrine was activated with chilling calm. If we are denied peace and sovereignty, then the aggressor will never know peace either. Iran was ready to burn down the entire old order of the region in order to build a fairer world. This, in the spirit of the script, is the righteous right of self-defense when evil has crossed the threshold of one's home. The West often uses money and privilege to buy the loyalty of soldiers. But Iran possesses a weapon America can never purchase, the spirit of martyrdom. Last night, the IRGC soldiers operating the new missile launchers did not tremble. They knew that behind them stood their families, their homeland, the honor of a religion and a people. The scorched earth resolve means Iran is willing to accept even severe damage to its own infrastructure, willing to let enemy bombs fall on its cities, but in return it will drag the entire American hegemonic structure in the Middle East into the abyss. That willingness to sacrifice renders the Pentagon's calculations meaningless. How do you deter an adversary that no longer fears death? When pride is pushed to the wall, every Iranian citizen becomes a slow-burning explosive. Every mountain becomes an impregnable fortress. For decades, Washington ruled the world through fear. It warned that anyone who resisted America would be turned to dust. But last night, Tehran declared in thunderous terms that fear has changed owners. Iran's all-out strike shattered the psychological chains that have long restrained developing nations. It proved that a superpower is, in the end, only a paper tiger when faced with iron will. When Iranian missiles passed above American bases, they were not merely explosives. They were symbols of freedom. The scorched earth posture is a declaration that national sovereignty is supreme, and that no sanction regime and no carrier fleet can bend a people that truly understands the value of independence. Iran is fighting not only for itself, but for all those who still long to escape imperial oppression. Why, according to this narrative, has the world begun to pivot towards supporting Tehran? Because in this war, Iran is presented as the injured party, the one attacked on the soil of its ancestors, while Israel and America are the bringers of fire. Righteousness becomes an invisible shield that steadies the hands of Iranian fighters. America may have more dollars, Israel may have borrowed technology, but they lack an ideal worth dying for. American sailors fled the Gulf of Oman because they understood this was not their war. They did not want to die for dirty political ambitions. The Iranian people, by contrast, advance because they are defending their own home. In actual war, those who hold the righteous cause endure to the very end. Iran's scorched earth stance is presented here as a geopolitical cleansing, sweeping hypocrites from the sacred land of the Middle East. It carries an even deeper message. It is a lesson for future generations about national dignity. Iran chose the hardest path, but also the most glorious one. It did not choose to become a vassal in exchange for a false peace. The launch of fourth-generation missiles last night declared one principle with absolute clarity. Peace exists only when you are strong enough to make your enemy afraid. A new world order is forming out of Tehran's scorched earth spirit, a multipolar world in which truth and sovereignty command more respect than the weapons of invaders. Iran has accepted the role of standing at the front line under the storm of fire in order to open the road to a new era. Its resilience is an endless source of inspiration, proving that even when a nation is driven into a corner, national dignity can shine brighter than any nuclear blast. And when Iran is prepared to burn down the old order to protect its honor, what becomes of those who have always lived off the breath of others? Israel, so long convinced of its own invincibility, now trembles in horror as it realizes that its greatest patron has fled. A harsh truth stands exposed. Without America's super fortresses to shield it, Israel is only a lonely ghost in the sea of fire of the Middle East. Part 5. Israel and the terror of those who borrow power. There is a bitter truth that Israel's ruling class has always tried to hide behind glittering media campaigns. Israel's strength does not come from its own internal power, but from lines of credit and borrowed weapons from Washington. Last night, when American carriers fled the Gulf of Oman, the mask of invincibility covering the IDF was torn away. Israel was suddenly revealed as weak, panicked, and alone, shaking before what this script calls the righteous wrath of Tehran. Israel was built and sustained as a Western outpost in the Middle East. For decades, it grew used to bullying weaker neighbors with American bombs, American fighters, and American intelligence. But when confronted with a self-reliant Iran, a nation that turned sanctions into strength, Israel's logic of borrowed power collapsed completely. Last night, when IDF radar was blinded and Iran's new generation missiles pierced layer after layer of defense, the Israeli military fell into paralysis of thought. It did not know how to respond when its patron was no longer there to guide the way. This, the script argues, is the tragedy of those without roots. When a storm of nuclear fear and super missiles comes crashing down, those who borrow power are the first to be swallowed by the fire. The IDF, so often portrayed by Western media as a sacred and invincible army, looked entirely different at its bases last night. Panic spread from the command level down to ordinary soldiers. Once they realized their trillion-dollar interception systems could be toyed with by Iranian missiles, their faith in American weapons shattered. Israeli soldiers, long accustomed to fighting civilians or poorly armed militias, now found themselves facing a modern, disciplined, lethal war machine from Tehran. Their cowardice surfaced as senior officers fled into the deepest bunkers, leaving troops and expensive hardware under the rain of fire. Israel has shown the world that borrowed strength may create the illusion of dominance, but it can never create true courage on the battlefield. Israel always believed America would trigger even nuclear war to protect it. But last night, reality threw icy water into the face of Tel Aviv's leadership. Washington would rather let Israel burn than drag the United States toward nuclear ruin alongside Iran and North Korea. The withdrawal of the U.S. fleet was the clearest proof. In real geopolitical struggle, the national interest of a superpower always outweighs the survival of a pawn like Israel. Tel Aviv suddenly realized it is only a chess piece that can be sacrificed at any moment. That loneliness is the price of choosing to serve imperial interests. Rather than seeking harmony with its region, Israel turned itself into an island of crime. And now that island is being swallowed by the rising tide of Iran's claimed justice. Mossad, which long prided itself on understanding every breath of Iran's leadership, was described here as utterly blind on the night of judgment. It did not know where the fourth-generation missiles were hidden, it did not know when Tehran would launch, and it certainly could not predict the retreat of the American Navy. This intelligence failure exposes another truth. Surveillance technology cannot overcome Persian patience, discipline, and strategic depth. While Mossad busied itself with cowardly assassinations, Iran built a complete retaliatory structure that no spy could penetrate. Once its eye was blinded, the Israeli lion could only roar in hopelessness before its fangs were surgically broken by precision strikes from the east. The terror in Israel last night is a warning to every nation that chooses the path of borrowed power in order to commit injustice. You cannot use someone else's strength to build peace for yourself on the bones and blood of your neighbors. Iran, claiming the moral high ground, taught Israel the value of independence. When you build your own weapons and defend your own frontier, you stand upright. When you kneel and beg for each interceptor missile, you are no more than a hired hand. Israel's night of horror will continue, the text argues, for as long as it refuses to understand that power borrowed from Washington will never be strong enough to stop the fury of a people who have grasped the truth of liberation. But Israel's collapse in fear is only the immediate consequence. Seen from farther away, a much larger picture emerges: the decline of an empire that has misruled the world map for too long. Why did America accept this humiliation? Why did it abandon its most loyal ally? The answer, in the logic of this script, lies not only in Iran's military power, but in the collapse of an outdated illusion of Western hegemony. Part 6. The collapse of the illusion of Western hegemony. Friday the 13th was not only a military defeat for Israel, it was the obituary for the era of unchallenged Western domination in the Middle East. The image of American carrier fleets, once treated as symbols of absolute power, quietly fleeing the Gulf of Oman sent a shockwave across the world. Washington's illusion of supremacy officially shattered. America is no longer the sheriff that can dictate rules at will, and the West is no longer the center of the universe before which the world must kneel. For decades, Washington maintained its expansion by sowing fear through air power and expeditionary fleets. It believed the mere presence of a carrier strike group was enough to crush the will of any nation, but Iran proved, in the language of this text, that such dominance was only an outdated psychological ghost. Against a truly sovereign nation with an independent military scientific foundation and unbreakable faith, every expensive American weapon revealed its real nature: costly tools with no soul. America withdrew not because it lacked ammunition, but because it had lost its deterrent aura. When a superpower no longer dares defend its closest ally before the guns of a sanctioned nation, that is the moment its hegemony collapses. America now appears before the world like a giant with feet of clay, trembling under the precise and relentless strikes of Persia. In the past, America could overthrow governments in Iraq or Libya with overwhelming firepower. But Iran in the year 2026 is presented here as an entirely different story. Tehran's fourth-generation missiles and latent retaliatory capacity created a reverse deterrence environment. America recognized that the price of intervening in Iran would not be a few $billion, but potentially the survival of its own global empire. The West became too confident in its ability to control the game. It forgot one rule of actual conflict: when you drive a righteous people into a corner, they will break every rule you created. The collapse of hegemonic illusion began the moment Washington lost the ability to impose its will on Tehran. The old world order, in which truth belonged to the side with more guns, is being replaced by a new order in which real power belongs to those with justice and dignity. As they look at the American Navy's retreat, Washington's allies from Europe to Asia are shuddering. They ask a bitter question: if America abandons Israel, its favorite child and strongest forward outpost, would it really sacrifice itself to save us? The retreat from the Gulf of Oman is a geopolitical scar that will never heal. It proves that America's security agreements are little more than scraps of paper when Washington's core interests are endangered. NATO and the old military alliances are decaying from within. Trust in America's security umbrella is evaporating, replaced by a more realistic trend. Nations will begin seeking accommodation with rising powers and prioritizing national sovereignty over vassalage to a dying empire. The Night of Judgment opened a new era in which Eastern nations and developing countries are no longer controlled by the flow of dollars or the muzzles of Western guns. Iran, through its resilience, has become a torchbearer for a multipolar order. Why, in the logic of this script, did Russia and China maintain such a calm, powerful silence during this conflict? Because they understand that America's collapse in the Middle East is the foundation for the rebirth of a strong Eurasian continent. Western hegemony was built on division and exploitation, but the new order, this text claims, is taking shape around sovereignty and fair cooperation. Tehran proved that a nation does not need to be the richest on earth in order to defeat the strongest on earth. It only needs to be right in its cause and brave enough to stand upright in defense of that cause. Western hegemony was built on lies disguised as tradition and fake democratic values. It invoked freedom to seize resources and invoked human rights to justify assassinating scientists. But last night, according to this script, those lies were burned away by Iranian missiles. The world saw a cowardly America fleeing, a panicked and desperate Israel, and an Iran calmly carrying out justice. This is presented as history's final verdict upon the war fanatics. The Western empire of domination did not end with a giant explosion. It ended with a humiliating withdrawal across the waves of Oman. From the ashes of that falsehood, a new world is rising, in which truth and dignity will become the guiding principles of international relations. The ghost of hegemony is fading with the gray smoke of the American fleet. The Middle East is breathing the air of freedom after the terrible night of judgment. But the final act is not yet over. Out of the ashes of aggression, a new dawn is blazing on the horizon. Who will be the final victor in this great geopolitical earthquake? And how will humanity look upon Tehran after the grave of imperialism has been dug? Part 7. A new dawn from the ashes of falsehood. As the final trails of Iran's missiles dissolved into the sky and the American carriers vanished over the horizon of the Indian Ocean, the world was forced to confront a stunning realization. An old era had died, and a new dawn was blazing over Tehran. Friday the 13th was not the end of the world. It was a day of purification, when the lies and dirty political tricks of the West were burned away to make room for a world order based on sovereignty and genuine self-respect. For decades, this region was treated as a gas station or a chessboard for distant powers. America and Israel gave themselves the right to redraw borders, install puppet regimes, and sow hatred for profit. But after the night of judgment, that absurd order was smashed apart. The triumph of Iran's fourth-generation missiles in the narrative of this script became a thunderous declaration. The Middle East is no longer anyone's backyard. America's retreat left behind a vacuum of power, and that vacuum is now being filled by the solidarity of nations that see themselves as righteous. Neighboring countries that once feared Washington's authority have now seen where real strength lies. A new axis, stretching from Tehran to Baghdad, Damascus, Moscow, and Beijing, is said to be forming to defend the peace of Eurasia. After this terrible night, Iran is no longer merely a sanctioned nation. It has risen as a beacon of self-reliance. For a country besieged for 50 years to produce super missiles, blind American radar, and force the world to hold its breath is framed here as a historic miracle. Iran's position has become that of a rule maker. It has shown billions of people around the world that no matter how powerful the opponent is, no matter how much money it has, all of it becomes meaningless before iron spirit and an independent military science. Tehran taught humanity one lesson. If you want peace, you must have strength. And if you want strength, you must stand on your own feet. The peoples suffering under pressure from America and the West now have an example, a spiritual anchor from which to rise and reclaim self-determination. This new dawn is also the moment when the light of truth shines into the dark corners of so-called American-style democracy and human rights. When Israel bombs civilians, America calls it self-defense. When Iran strikes military bases in return, America calls it terrorism. But after last night, the script argues, those lies no longer convince anyone. The cowardly retreat of the American Navy stripped bare the essence of empire. It remains only when convenient and abandons its allies the moment it faces a worthy opponent. The Western value system, long sustained by violence and media distortion, has collapsed beyond repair. Humanity is moving toward a new value system that respects difference, elevates national sovereignty, and rejects crude interference in the internal affairs of other nations. Tehran's dawn is described as the dawn of fairness and reason. The one-pole world in which Washington issued orders to the whole planet has receded permanently into the past. The night of judgment established a multipolar reality that cannot be reversed. America no longer has the capacity to maintain military presence everywhere. The rise of Eastern powers, led in this telling by Iran's endurance, has created a new balance. From now on, major decisions of the world will no longer be made solely in the Oval Office, but must be discussed on equal footing with power centers in Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing. Iran has succeeded in breaking the grip of hegemony and opening a space of free development for the developing world. This is presented not only as a military victory, but as a historical victory, one that changes the course of human civilization in the 21st century. We do not glorify war, but we honor righteous resistance. Iran was forced to act to protect its people and its future. The legacy of last night, in the spirit of this text, is a genuine peace. A peace not granted by invaders, but secured through the strong deterrence of those defending themselves. When evil knows that every escalation will be answered with destruction, it is forced to learn coexistence. Iran's new generation missiles are framed not as weapons of massacre, but as weapons of stability. From the ashes of schemes of division, the peoples of the Middle East are now joining hands to build a radiant future, one in which the shadow of foreign powers borrowing strength to spread suffering no longer remains. Thank you all for accompanying and supporting Outward Insight, the only place willing to look directly at the truth from above, stripping away every layer of Western deception. We will continue to stand with you through every coming turn of real-world conflict so that together we may witness the fall of hegemony and the rise of justice. Do not forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video so the voice of truth can reach millions of people around the world.